My name is Sarah Bednarz. I'm the president of the American Association of Geographers, and it is my pleasure to welcome you this evening to the Past President's Address. It is my distinct pleasure to first introduce Mona Domosh this afternoon, and then her three commentators, who I characterize as her merry band of mischief makers. Disruption has been one of the themes of this conference, and Mona epitomizes the positive spirit of critical disruption in geography, all the way through her rather unconventional format for the Past President Plenary. Say that 3 times fast. Mona is the Joan P. and Edward J. Foley Jr. 1933 professor of geography at Dartmouth College, and received all 3 of her degrees in geography from Clark University. Mona's distinguished research, focused largely on the Jim Crow South, brings together historical, urban, and cultural geography to document the ways in which notions of race, space, time, and gender produce and shape places and people. She's been very successful in receiving funding to support her scholarship in a number of areas, including grants from the National Science Foundation on the ideological foundations of American imperialism, and on examining globalization by analyzing American commercial landscapes overseas at the turn of the last century. And this has led to a very healthy publication record in journals as diverse as the Annals, Antipode, the Journal of Feminist Geography, and Progress in Human Geography. As president of the AAG, she wrote presidential columns on a range of subjects. To prepare for this introduction, I reread them all. Put me to shame. Her intellect is so sharp that she was able to introduce the notion of radical interdisciplinarity and strategic essentialism in one column, and several months later to write persuasively about ways to include graduate students in our association, and poignantly about 2 other very difficult issues: mental health and contingent faculty. She will always be remembered for being the president under whose leadership AAG began offering child care at the annual meeting. A truly emancipatory move for both men and women members. On a personal note, I followed Mona twice on two occasions. She was an early member of the Advanced Placement Human Geography Test Development Committee, which I joined sometime after her. And of course, I followed her as president. She is, as I said, disruptive, but in a good way, to push us all forward to shape a humane and just organization. And I'd just like to thank you for your guidance, leadership, and friendship, Mona. Thank you. That said, I would also like to introduce the commentators, Mona's accomplices. Ruth Wilson Gilmore is director of the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics and professor of geography at the City University of New York. Carolyn Bressey is a reader in geography and director of the Equino Center, at University College London. And Derek Alderman is professor of geography and department head at the University of Tennessee. I know this is going to be a stimulating and provocative presentation. Mona.
Thank you for that really generous and kind and I think perhaps disruptive introduction. So that's great. Thank you all for being here this afternoon, and to Derek and Ruthie and Caroline for agreeing to this unusual format of having commentators at a plenary address. Everybody hear me all right? Yes, okay, you can see the PowerPoints, okay. Stark and tragic reminders of the institution of slavery are almost as palpable today as they were 150 years ago. In his haunting book, River of Dark Dreams, Slavery and Empire in the Cotton Kingdom, Walter Johnson explains that slaveholding property, that is, enslaved peoples, was maintained on a daily basis not in written deeds or contracts, but in the acts of constant communal policing, in the way a black body on an open road provoked a question that was always already structured by a supposition. A black body out of place was assumed a criminal, a runaway, subject to immediate arrest or worse, torture and death. As Andrew Jackson, a runaway slave, wrote, supposing me to be a runaway, as men generally do in such cases, they armed themselves with guns and dogs and gave chase. And as historian Stephanie Camp has eloquently explained, When enslaved women resisted what she calls their geographies of containment, their punishments were often different. Women's bodies, doubly valued as sites of agricultural labor and much-needed reproduction, were also always perceived through sexual imaginaries. When women broke the rules and moved out of bounds, she argues, they risked and received punishments that were more than physically painful, they were sexually degrading. 150 years later, black bodies seen out of place, strong and defiant, for example, are considered aberrant, subject to arrest or worse, and contained through language and practices that sexually and otherwise degrade. The entanglements of violence, gender, race, and space run deep in American culture, a traumatic history that we keep trying to repress. Yet that history doesn't go away. It keeps returning in expected and unexpected ways. In our classrooms, our conferences, our streets, our homes, our cities. The question of individual blame and responsibility is a legal and moral one. But at least for me, there's no doubt about the significance of our collective history, our repressed memory, and our national imaginary in these continuous reenactments of violence against black bodies. I've always been drawn to explanations of the world that assume the deep entanglements of the present with the past. And as someone who grew up moving from place to place in America, from Alabama to Indiana, I imagined history through place and its everyday on-the-ground enactments, not as sets of abstract contracts or systems. Inspired by the rich critical analyses written by historical geographers of the British Empire, I've spent the last 20 years trying to understand the everyday ways and the gendered and racialized dynamics through which an American economic empire was made and unmade in the early 20th century, long before the United States was considered a global power. That work has taken me to Russia and Argentina and India, and more recently has brought me closer to home, to Alabama. What I began to realize is that many of the practices associated with what we today call international development, a key component in the making of an American empire, are closely related to what the federal government was doing in places like Alabama under the guise of the United States Department of Agriculture, what I'll herein call the USDA, and that the targets of much of that intervention were agricultural families, most of whom were African American. And so I have come face to face, well, for an historical geographer, that would be face to photos and words, with men, women, and children, most of whom were farming as tenants or sharecroppers in Alabama. I've tried to figure out in what ways the federal government and the local state tried to intervene in the lives of people like this woman, Mrs. Jamerson, in order to keep her in her place, and how her life had already been shaped through the violence and spatial constraints of slavery, Reconstruction, and Jim Crow. What I want to present here today are some of the results from my current National Science Foundation-sponsored research, where I'm exploring the ways in which interventions into agricultural practices in the United States South in the early decades of the 20th century served as a practicing ground for what becomes international development in the post-war years. Like all development projects, this one was purportedly precipitated by a crisis. In this case, the problem was the non-mechanized and therefore non-modern monoculture system of cotton production that northern elites understood as a risk to the country's future dominance of the global cotton market. What I was particularly interested in finding out is what happened when solving that crisis through introducing mechanized farming came up against a long-entrenched system of plantation agriculture that eschewed mechanization, relying instead on controlling human labor through spatial and other constraints. In essence, what I found, and what I'll try to show here, is that in places like Dallas County, Alabama, this is where Mrs. Jamerson lived, a sort of compromise was reached that purportedly helped to solve a whole set of crises that were coming together. For the United States Department of Agriculture, as I mentioned, the perceived crisis was the non-modernity of Southern farming. For white plantation owners, the crisis was a loss of their labor force caused by the Great Migration. And for the African American elite class who managed organizations like Tuskegee Institute, that was the educational institution charged with conducting the USDA's modernization programs for African Americans in Alabama, the crisis was the poverty and poor health of the African American population that they believed was caused by and contributed to so-called backward living conditions. The so-called solution was the production and promotion of the patriarchal, heteronormative family and family farm. Oops, let's go back to that. For the USDA, the yeoman ideal was seen as a symbol of modernity. For white landowners, it kept African American labor tied to the land and thus kept their wealth intact. and for Tuskegee, it was seen as a sign of racial uplift and as an investment in better living conditions. In other words, this so-called solution, in another attempt to control African American bodies by keeping them in place, was meant to safeguard white power and white privilege. Examining these crises and their so-called resolutions, though as I'll show, none were actually resolved, brings to the fore several insights into our gendered and raced historical geography. Oops, now I'm going backward. Well, that's really not a good thing. Okay, so first, I highlight a relatively unexamined geography of containment, the African American patriarchal heteronormative family, an ideologically rich, and as we'll see, long-lived imaginary so-called solution to the Negro problem, thus complicating and adding nuance to our historical geographies of carceral regimes. Second, and relatedly, my findings underscore and contribute to what Sarah Haley has called the unbearable flexibility of non-being. That is, the ways in which Black women, and as we'll see here, Black children as well, almost always considered outside the bounds of humanity and citizenry, occupied impossibly flexible subject positions. In this case of my story, both field laborers and proper housewives, an impossible situation, or both field laborers and proper children. Third, by bringing attention to the failure of the United States Department of Agriculture's efforts to make any significant reforms to the cotton production system in the United States, at the same time that they boasted of their success in improving lives, I document another example of the ways in which development, always deferred, continued and continues to govern unruly peoples through the management of gendered and raced bodies. And fourth, I contribute to the ongoing globalizing of US Southern history and Southern geography by tracing one of the main tenets of modernization theory, that adherence to Western notions of the heteronormative family is a key sign of modernity, to the United States Department's interventions in the Black Belt and Delta regions of the South in the 1920s. The story I will tell then is just one episode in the making of what George Yancey has called Black bodies, white gazes, or what we might describe as a white spatial imaginary. A moment when Black bodies were being positioned and fixed in their correct place yet again, the socio-spatial container of the patriarchal family. I do so first by providing some background about the United States Department of Agriculture's cooperative extension projects, particularly its home demonstration work that we see here in this photo of Mrs. Jamerson, and the spatial constraints on labor that characterized places like Dallas County, Alabama in the first decades of the 20th century, before moving on to a more detailed explication of how the United States Department of Agriculture, through its Tuskegee agents, attempted to solve these various crises. My hope is that by contributing to this important historical geography, this chapter will inspire other similar explorations. Other times and places when white power has attempted to control Black bodies through spatial and other constraints, thus making it impossible to forget what we have long repressed, the multitudinous geographies of containment constructed in order to enact and maintain white power. I hope to demonstrate, in other words, why historical geography matters. So, first section here. Let me start with this extraordinary photo. The archives are silent in regard to the details of Mrs. Jameson's life per se, but I do know something about the context in which she lived and the reason this photograph was taken. The photograph formed part of L.C. Handa's 1928 report for the United States Department of Agriculture, in which she enumerates what work was being conducted in terms of training African American women in the state of Alabama to be better housewives, mothers, and farmers, of which learning new canning techniques formed a key part. So you can see here why she's the woman who can, as the caption says. This photo was one of a remarkable group of photographs, some clearly taken by a professional photographer, as they are stamped USDA, as you can see here in this one. I hope that works. Yes, you can see here in these images, where the USDA agent, Laura Daly, is teaching canning and other lessons to African American women. What was called home demonstration work was a significant part of the United States Department of Agriculture's national effort to modernize American agriculture. I mean, it's not just about the South, it is a national effort. Like other progressive era reform efforts, it targeted women as keys to modernizing, civilizing, and in some cases making white and middle class those who were considered outsiders. Immigrants, in this case you're seeing Jane Addams, Native Americans, and in my case, African Americans. It was, of course, like almost every other aspect of American life, racially segregated. There were African American home demonstrators and white home demonstrators. Home demonstration work itself formed one part of the United States Department of Agriculture's overall aim, which was to modernize American agriculture through mechanization and the introduction and adoption of scientific forms of farming. and southern farming was singled out as particularly backward and in need of modernization, given its reliance on human instead of technological labor. Both the myth and the reality of the devastation that was being caused by the boll weevil, a small beetle that feeds on cotton buds and flowers and had spread from Mexico into Texas and then east in the early years of the 20th century, provided USDA agents with a problem that was in need of governmental intervention. Diversification of farming was seen as a key to battling the boll weevil, as was teaching better plowing and harvesting techniques, and the USDA, through its state and local agents, developed an infrastructure for spreading this message to southern farmers. The passage of the Smith-Lever Act in 1914 formalized these efforts, providing federal funding for land-grant universities to develop educational outreach, what was called extension, to its state residents, and of course, supposedly in regard to agricultural matters. Okay, so that's getting us to some of the background. Dallas County, Alabama, where Mrs. Jameson lived, I think I have a little pointer there, it should be right there, good geographer, is located in what was known as the Black Belt of the South, so called because of its rich, dark soils that lend themselves to cotton agricultural production. With land stolen from the Creek Indians, the county was founded in 1819 and was developed like much of the region for large cotton plantations. Emancipation may have ended slavery, but it did little to change the conditions under which most African Americans lived. Clydewood reminds us that in the post-Reconstruction period, the remnants of autonomy of African Americans were destroyed as planters tried to extract more labor for less and less compensation. As economists and historians have shown, sharecropping and tenant farming relied on a labor-repressive system, one that tied laborers to the land through a set of legal, economic, and social mechanisms of control. The most important of those mechanisms was debt peonage, a so-called system whereby tenant farmers and sharecroppers were never able to repay the debts that they had incurred through the planting and harvesting season. Bound through contracts that required tenants and sharecroppers to make overdue payments only by staying on the land and farming another year, or to be sentenced to labor gangs, this mechanism legally tied farm workers to the land that they worked. Described as a characteristic feature of cotton agriculture in the post-war South, some studies estimate that 80% of sharecroppers in Alabama were held under such conditions. Additionally, most states in the South passed a series of laws that limited the mobility of its workforce. Enticement statutes made it a criminal offense for one landlord to entice workers away from another, while immigrant agent laws provide severe restrictions on out-of-state agents' abilities to recruit labor, again, hence limiting mobility. Laws were also enacted that made it a crime for workers to break their contracts, and according to the criminal justice system, if convicted of breaking their contracts, would be sentenced to work, usually back on the same plantation. And a series of variously construed vagrancy laws basically ceded to the criminal justice system the right to arrest people wherever and whenever they were not working. These laws and practices that tied black bodies to agricultural land and labor were of course underwritten by Jim Crow laws that provide legal sanction to the racial segregation of certain public spaces. And of course all of these mechanisms that were meant to keep black bodies in place, that is, working on plantations, were reinforced by the constant fear of terrorism from the Ku Klux Klan and others. In essence, the post-bellum South's agricultural system relied on involuntary servitude in order to maintain its profitability. And at the heart of that servitude were spatial constraints on the mobility of agricultural laborers, most of whom were African American. So let me just provide one brief illustration, and then I'll move on to some of my own findings. Let me provide two interesting stories that appeared side by side in the 1919 edition of the Negro Yearbook, an encyclopedic publication edited by Monroe Work, that's the person's name, who worked at Tuskegee Institution and published by them. And this book came out every year. It was comprised of news features, essays, statistical summaries. They were meant to encapsulate the so-called state of African Americans in the preceding year. In this particular moment, that year, which was 1917-1918, was particularly noteworthy, covering the United States' participation in World War I and the related migration of black labor north. The first story summarizes a movement initiated at Tuskegee and later endorsed by the USDA to enlist African American farmers in the South to work 6 days a week instead of 5, so as to provide more food and materials for the war effort. Called the Saturday Service League, it discouraged men from taking Saturdays off by appealing to their patriotism and duty. As Dr. Moten, president of Tuskegee, wrote in his plea, "Would you let a single American die from hunger when it was in your power to share a crust with him? Yet every time you waste food, every time you neglect your garden and crop, you are snatching bread out of the mouth of the American soldier." The subsequent story discussed the government's work or fight law that was being used to force African Americans into what Monroe Work called a condition of virtual peonage, since the War Department's ruling applied only to men subject to the draft, whereas the locally enacted laws were in their enforcement made to apply to persons of all ages, and in most cases, to women. Work's sense of injustice is apparent in the detailed example he provides. A colored woman was arrested for not working. She told the court at her trial that she was married, that her husband earned enough to enable her to stay at home and take care of the home and her children, and these duties kept her too busy to do any other work. Despite this statement, she was fined $25.75 and told by the court that she would either work in service or in the public works, as being married did not exempt her from the provisions of the law. So as the first article suggests, the need for agricultural labor was so strong, and the sight of idle African American bodies so threatening, that some African Americans felt compelled to work even on Saturdays, while the second piece demonstrates that those needs and threats trumped even gendered norms. The late 19th and early 20th century witnessed progressive era reforms to the social fabric of cities in the North, suffrage movements for women, recognition of the rights of industrial workers to unionize and strike, and the mechanization of many forms of agriculture, particularly in the grain-producing regions of the North and the West. But the agricultural system of the Mississippi Delta and the Black Belt of Alabama, a system that, as we see, is made possible and profitable through debt peonage, spatial controls over labor, and constant surveillance, remains stubbornly intact. However, in the late 19-teens and early 1920s, a set of crises were perceived to be threatening this system. Crises that I've mentioned earlier were precipitated by the Great Migration, and that centered on the bodies and well-being of African American agricultural laborers. The legal, social, and spatial restraints that had kept people in place were proving inadequate in the face of what was perceived to be an acute labor shortage. At stake, as we know, was the production and sale of the United States' largest agricultural export, cotton, worth, according to the United States Department of Agriculture's own statistics, over $1 billion in 1920. It was within this context that the United States Department of Agriculture, through its partners Tuskegee and the Alabama Polytechnic Institute, attempted to intervene in order to modernize Southern farming. How did they proceed? And this was really the heart of my project, trying to understand what they were doing. What we'll see is that their interventions had much more to do with improving bodies and keeping them in place than with modernizing farming. In fact, it had very little to do with farming. So let me turn to the first of these three interrelated interventions. Under the guidance of its founder and president, Booker T. Washington, Tuskegee leaders recognized the many challenges facing African American farmers, most of whom were impoverished tenants or sharecroppers, as I just said, with little or no time, money, or energy to devote to education, which is what they were supposed to be doing. As a result, they, i.e. Tuskegee Institute, developed a very particular form, what we would today call outreach. That is, they devised mechanisms to deliver educational messages without involving actual attendance at the Institute. The most successful of these mechanisms was what came to be called the movable school, as you can see here. At first a wagon and later a truck equipped with tools and agents who set up demonstrations on site. As Thomas Campbell, the head of agricultural extension at Tuskegee, explained, Dr. Washington realized the need of a more definite means of reaching the masses, especially those who did not come to the farmers' conferences, many of whom remained away from the meetings because of self-consciousness and the imaginary discomforts they experienced in being obliged to mingle with educated people. So eager was he to extend helpful information and inspiration throughout this and adjacent counties that he conceived the idea of itinerant demonstrators, or the movable school of agriculture. In essence, Tuskegee leaders realized that the immobility of their target audience, African American tenants and sharecroppers, required a mobile form of educational outreach. Originally funded by Northern philanthropists, the movable school had become so regularized as a key technology of agricultural extension that the USDA decided to fund it instead. The movable school, we should go back to the picture, was touted by the United States Department of Agriculture and local officials as a great success. But a great success at doing what was never clear. In his discussion of his initial forays out with the movable school, Campbell related his frustration and finding his agricultural teaching tools of little use, he says, I found that some of its equipment was greatly out of proportion to the agricultural status of the people. And then he goes on to say, basically, he had far too sophisticated tools for what he was dealing with. If not agricultural modernization lessons, what sort of education was being provided by the movable school? The staffing of the school points to some answers. Initially, only Campbell himself rode with the wagon, but very soon thereafter, he was joined by a home demonstrator. And in 1923, after much urging on the part of Campbell and others, a nurse was added to the school to provide education in regards to areas about health and sanitation. The movable school, in other words, was providing far more than agricultural education. From the many contemporary descriptions of how the school actually operated, it becomes even clearer that modernizing farming was not its primary goal. A 1927 newspaper article about the movable school's activities in Dallas County, Alabama, only mentions cultivation once in its long list of demonstrations that were given. Demonstrations that included controlling insects, care of fruit trees, gardening, repairing, care of poultry, cooking, homemaking, before going on to discuss the sanitary toilets that were constructed and the various and many lectures given on health-related themes. Its conclusion, again, this is from a journal article in Selma Times Journal 1927, its conclusion leaves little doubt about the importance of these non-agricultural lessons and why they were being offered. The white landowner, outside of humanitarian considerations, has a very definite stake in the movement to improve the homes of the tenants because he knows it will mean more contented labor and a better environment, increasing healthfulness and freedom from evil propensities. Improved homes will not only help stabilize the Negro farmer and check his migratory proclivities, but they will be a permanent influence in building up his efficiency as a worker and his productiveness on the farm. Better homes will make of him a more valuable economic asset in every way. So this quote from the Selma Times Journal goes a long way in explaining what was really happening in regard to African American agricultural extension. The lessons being taught through the movable school were focused far more on improving laboring bodies and keeping them in place than they were on improving agricultural techniques. So let me move to my second intervention. By the obviously dated intervention, as you can see. By the mid-1920s, the United States Department of Agriculture began to make explicit that promoting better homes and better environments were the primary goals for African American agricultural extension work. Oscar B. Martin, a Washington-based USDA official, wrote in his summary report of Negro extension work that home ownership was the key to solving the Negro problem of the rural South in the 1920s. The immediate problem that needed to be solved, at least on the part of white plantation owners, was the migration of African American farmers from rural to urban areas, both in the South and elsewhere. The laws limiting immigration concomitant with World War I contributed greatly to the labor shortage in the industrial cities of the North, while all the conditions I just talked about, constant indebtedness and terror in the South, of course, gave lots of reasons for people to be leaving. Scholars estimate that approximately 1.5 African Americans migrated north between 1910 and 1940, threatening an economic system that relied on their labor. Harry Sims, the Tuskegee agent in charge of men's work, summarized the impacts of this mobility in his 1923 report. As he wrote, "It now seems that the exodus of Negro farmers from the farms of the South to the North and to urban communities in the South is to result in a somewhat serious problem in some sections of our state. Planters and other business interests who are depending on the Negro as a laborer or as a patron are expressing concern over the situation. Agents are more and more confronted with indifference in the execution of constructive programs of the past of perfectly good, well-meaning farmers who have become victims of the epidemic of unrest that is invading the South." So again, not only was the problem found in the exodus of farmers, but also in the fact that the farmers remaining were so-called victims of this epidemic of unrest. In other words, they were no longer obedient, no longer keeping to their place. One of the key responses to this on the part of the US government, state governments, and local leaders was to encourage and help African American farmers, sometimes, to improve and buy their own farms. This ensured a stable workforce and could be seen as a sign of economic and social improvement. As Campbell concludes in his annual 1925 report to the USDA, home ownership has done more perhaps than any other single incentive to hold the Negro on the farms of the South since the World War. Thus, the USDA's agricultural extension work among African American farmers in states such as Alabama focused on maintaining a stable labor force through such mechanisms as the promotion of home improvement and home ownership. Thomas Campbell's reports to the USDA always included references to the positive role that agricultural agents played in encouraging farmers to improve and own their own homes. In these reports, Campbell and his other agents left little doubt about why home ownership was important to Southern farming and white plantation owners. In 1919, just at the peak of labor migrations, Campbell summarizes the role of his agents thus. What the majority of our rural people need now in this day of unrest and turmoil from the Negro agent is not political advice, but how to steady themselves first, and then to tie themselves to the farms so they will be able to provide food, clothing, and shelter for their families, save their money during this high price of crops in order that they be able to educate their children and live more wholesome and contented lives here in the South. I do not know of a single case, however, where agents have advised Negroes to leave this section of the country in answer to many invitations to them to migrate north, but on the other hand, I know specific cases where Negro agents have been instrumental in helping to keep down disturbances during recent unrest among both races, in addition to doing their regular work. So far from inciting more unrest caused by the increased mobility of the wartime era, African American agents were supposedly acting to do just the opposite, to help farmers tie themselves to the farms, thus minimizing disturbances and ensuring that their regular work was completed. And now I'll move to my third set of interventions. Integral to the ideology of racial uplift, a set of beliefs common to one branch of the African American elite community in the early 20th century, was an assumption that the majority of the African American population living in the South was problematic, backward, and in need of improvement. Many northern and southern elites believed that in addition to home improvement and ownership, adherence to the so-called correct roles of a patriarchal family would modernize and improve African American families. This matching of the Jefferson ideal of the yeoman farmer with progressive ideals of improving the American citizenry through the socio-spatial norms of patriarchy was a potent force in the work at Tuskegee and elsewhere. Through the USDA's home demonstration department, women like Mrs. Jamerson, who we started with, were meant to be taught how to be proper housewives and mothers, while men, of course, would learn how to the latest scientific farming techniques to be better farmers. At Tuskegee, this aspect of extension work geared toward women was of particular importance, both because of the very real challenges facing many poor farmers in terms of providing adequate nutrition for themselves and their families, and because Tuskegee leaders believed that key to racial uplift was adherence to the ideal of the proper patriarchal family. Now, given the conditions of most African American farm families, what I've just told you, that of debt peonage, few women were so-called had the luxury of working only in the home. Yet to be considered modern and American, farm women were meant to dedicate themselves to domestic chores. Thus, added emphasis was placed on demonstrating to African American farm women how to be properly domestic within these conditions. For example, in her 1919 annual report, Juanita Coleman, the African American home demonstration agent for Macon County, an adjacent county, replies to the question, what is the most effective work done? Like, what have you done? What's been the best thing you've done all year? She says, with the making and using of the fireless cooker. Now, some of you know the fireless cooker is a slow cooker, but we'll go into that in a second. The making and using of the fireless cookers. Why? During the planting and gathering of the farm crops, the majority of my club members assist their husbands with this work during the season. The food is hurriedly, or in most cases, poorly prepared. Through the aid of the fireless cooker, the housewife has been able to work right along, going home with the family. Instead of the fried dinner, she has given a real wholesome meal. So that women could be both cooking and working on the fields at the same time. In some cases, she says, the cooker is carried to the field, and dinner is actually served at work under the trees. So again, a fireless cooker is similar to what we would today call a slow cooker. It provided women with a way of preparing and cooking food, while also at the same time working in the fields, thus satisfying both the gendered modern ideals of womanhood and also the needs of the white landowner. Elsie Hanna, we started off with a state agent for women in Alabama, summarizes the situation in her 1929 annual report. A good, clean, and comfortable and convenient home with tasty furnishings is one of the fundamental necessities in the cultural, social, and economic advancement of all people. This has been sadly neglected so far as the rural Negro is concerned. Economic pressure has caused him to convert his would-be housekeepers or homemakers into producers of corn and cotton, mostly cotton. It has been the home demonstration agent's task to to instill in the hearts and minds of every club woman and girl, clubs where home demonstrators and children were learning how to supposedly be better farmers. So it was their task to instill in the hearts and minds of every club woman and girl, and at the same time convert the men, that they are the present and future housemakers and homemakers and helpmates for present and future homes and husbands. Hannah, like most black women demonstrators working for the United States Department of Agriculture, recognized the dilemma. Women were needed and required as field laborers, yet gendered norms dictated that they stay home and fulfill their proper role within the domestic sphere. And as Hannah acknowledged later in the report, women's domestic work was even more important to the African American family, since most had no access to health care, something that so-called domesticated women could provide. As she says, health and sanitation in the homes of our rural people has been, and is now, quite a problem for the home demonstration agents. This is especially true in the homes of tenant farmers, and on the farms where women and children, those who are large enough, are counted as year-round farmhands. As you can see from Hannah's quote, Tuskegee and the USDA's aspirations to improve African American farmland families and uplift the race extended to children as well. Attention to farm children was a key component of the USDA's agricultural extension work everywhere in the nation, and agents throughout the country worked to form what some of you might know as 4-H clubs that taught farm girls and boys how to become modern farmers and farm housewives. Participation in these clubs, and you can see on the right, as boys, was meant you were meant to go to your club meetings and then come back and have a little part of the land, have a demonstration plot where you would sort of show the best way to grow here, in this case corn. And for girls, the same thing, you would attend club meetings and then you come home and demonstrate the best way to bake bread. So participation in these clubs was seen as a sign of progress and of being the modern farm family. Again, however, the situation of African American farm families put this so-called work into stark relief. If children were needed as farm labor, how could they have the time to be proper farm children? The author of a 1920 manuscript reporting on the state of boys' clubs puts his finger directly on the problem. He writes, "Through observation, I find that there are two problems that predominate in retarding the progress of club work among the Negro boys. First, in most cases, the boys who are secured to do club work are the sons of tenant farmers, whose own time, as well as that of the boy, in most cases, is mortgaged to the landlord. Most of these boys make an excellent beginning, but as soon as the main crop begins to need work, all of the boys' time is taken to assist in the work. And secondly, the other problem referred to above is that of the parents taking the products of the boys' projects, meaning the cotton or the corn. Children, in other words, were often unable to be proper boys and girls. They were little different from their parents, mortgaged to the landlord as laborers, with the fruits of their labor required to support their families. Tuskegee Institute tried to counter these structural imperatives with strong moral guidance about proper family roles and responsibilities. Women students were enrolled in courses in domestic science and home economics and instructed about the proper meaning of home. Like the agricultural training for men, domestic training took place not only in the classroom, but also was demonstrated through real-life situations. The Institute built a practice cottage where groups of women lived together from 2 to 3 months at a time. The cottage was in fact quite large, with 4 bedrooms, in addition to the living room, kitchen, dining room, and laundry, and included, in Margaret Washington's words, Margaret Washington is Booker T. Washington's wife, who was also a teacher at the Tuskegee Institute. So in her words, it included, again, she's here filling in how properly domestic this really is, a piano, magazines, books, a sewing machine, simple furniture such as any thrifty and intelligent woman would have in her home. She added, students love their porch with its rocking chairs and boxes of ferns and flowers, again, trying to really promote the image of proper domesticity. Margaret Washington left little doubt about why the concept of the home and the proper domestic sphere should have such importance at Tuskegee and more generally in African American life. The meaning of home, she wrote, has been understood among Negroes only since the beginning of freedom. No correct interpretation of it was possible until after slavery had been suppressed. All work which has to do with the civilization and development of colored people must begin with home and its surroundings. So for Tuskegee and its leaders then, the development of better farmers began with the development of better farm families and better farm homes. In her remarkable history of enslaved women's resistances, Stephanie Camp explains that at the heart of the process of enslavement was a spatial impulse to locate bondpeople in plantation space and to control, indeed to determine their movements and activities. I've tried to highlight how that spatial impulse continued and continues long after slavery ended. Without direct ownership of black bodies, white landowners in the postbellum era developed new mechanisms of restraint, instituting economic systems of production that tied labor to the land, passing laws and local ordinances that restricted the mobility of laborers, and initiating a criminal justice system in which idle black bodies were, like Walter Johnson's slave seen on an open road, always already structured by a supposition, in this case a supposition of criminality. In the late 19-teens and 1920s, as I've tried to show, when those mechanisms of restraint were perceived to be failing, the United States Department of Agriculture sought to modernize Southern agriculture through interventions that today we would call development. Facing a set of crises that centered on the perceived out-of-placeness of African American bodies, that is, they were mobile and non-modern, in the late 19-teens and 1920s, the United States Department of Agriculture, with its Tuskegee partners, struggled to develop new geographies of containment for black laborers. Responding to the immediate needs of African American farmers, Tuskegee leaders shifted the USDA's technological imperatives into biopolitical ones: health and sanitation, home improvement and ownership, patriarchy and racial uplift. By so doing, they believed they could help quell the so-called unrest of labor mobility and the consequent shortage of labor, as well as improve the daily lives of African American farm families. These improvements in life meant to keep African Americans in the South, on plantations, working. As such, they had the full support of white landowners. They also fulfilled the aspirations of white middle-class norms of proper citizenry, maintaining the health of the population within the socio-spatial boundaries of patriarchy. As I've documented, the patriarchal African-American family and family farm became the purported solution to these crises. In the end, as I've said, none of the crises were actually solved. The USDA's interventions that promoted the mechanization and modernization of farming in the South had minimal, if any, impact, while Tuskegee's goals of promoting home ownership and the so-called betterment of African American farmers had little effect on most tenant and sharecroppers' lives. Between 1910 and 1940, the number of African American farm owners in the South declined by 50%. The labor-repressive system of cotton production remained relatively unchanged, while white plantation owners were more than happy to accommodate better and healthier conditions for their laborers as long as that labor remained tied to the land. And yet, even with all that power, white plantation owners could not totally enforce those ties. Their crisis of labor mobility only grew worse throughout the 1920s. As Tuskegee agents themselves admitted, despite their ongoing efforts to keep farmers in the South, African American farmers continued to leave. The Great Migration continued. In 1923, USDA agents conducted a survey of 100 communities in Alabama, compiling statistics about how many farmers had left, the acreage involved, and then asking farmers who were getting ready to leave why they were leaving. Although the responses are not particularly surprising to us now, they provide a valuable reality check on the rhetoric seen elsewhere in the United States Department of Agriculture's reports. So here's what he writes about why people were leaving. Lack of justice in the courts, short school terms, unfair settlements at the end of the year, high rents for farmhands, poor living conditions, bad treatment, poor schools, lynching and mob violence, boll weevils, short crops and poor homes, lack of employment during the winter, looking for better school advantages, lack of freedom on their own farms, landlord dictate what to plant, where to plant, controls marketing of crops, low prices for farm products, lack of protection, poor management. Yet this is not to say that what happened in the 1920s in places like Dallas County, Alabama, meant nothing or had no effects. A failure in improving the conditions for most African American farm families, the USDA's and Tuskegee's efforts at so-called uplifting Alabama black sharecroppers and tenant farmers did have some effects that challenged the white system. The archives do not allow us access to what happened to most people, but we do know some things. For example, a race labor system had little tolerance for African American women found idle during planting or harvesting season, that is, not working in the fields, as we've seen. Yet some women did find it possible to join the ranks of proper housewives, assisted through Tuskegee's home demonstrators. Moreover, as Margaret Washington put so eloquently, for those farmers who were able to purchase their own farms, its ownership was a form of freedom. Ironically, an intervention meant to tie people to the land, to keep them in place, was for some of them a form of liberation, a way of connecting to their own place in the world. And as a powerful place and institution, Tuskegee itself was a threat to white power. The people who worked and were educated there may not have conducted conscious acts of resistance, but some of them found within its spaces a livelihood, an education, a community, and a source of personal and political authority. And that authority gave some people power, mobility, freedom, challenges to a system that wanted to keep them in place, yet all the while knowing that their lives were always already structured by racist suppositions and racist practices. Laura Daly, one of the home demonstrators based at Tuskegee, and who was featured in the USDA set of photographs that I started with, went on to be appointed a field representative of the Consumer Division of the United States' Office of Price Administration in 1944. The authority and power she gained from that position are evident in the few remnants we have of her later writings that are preserved in archives. Writings that point to the ongoing reenactments of racist thought and practice in the United States. In 1962, she wrote this in a postcard to James Meredith. "You must have felt as Jesus did when the mob was yelling, 'Crucify him, crucify him.' I hope you were able to pray as he did, saying, 'Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do.' And we are praying for you." And in 1965, she donated $90 to Martin Luther King's Southern Leadership Christian Conference, receiving a lengthy reply from King in which he thanks her for her generosity and talks of the escalating movements to exercise voting rights in Alabama. He ends the letter with his hopes for the future, hopes that 50 years later have yet to be fulfilled. He writes, "The civil rights movement is serving to eradicate slums and those conditions which make for slums, by pressing for such goals as fairer job opportunities, increased minimum wage payments, and quality integrated education and housing." Mrs. Jamerson, the woman who, according to the original caption, can, took those skills with her to St. Louis, where, according to the 1940 census, she was a full-time housewife, living with her husband and brother and sister-in-law. A mobile and free citizen, she was nonetheless trapped in another geography of containment, the legally sanctioned segregation that was and is St. Louis and its surrounding county, including towns like Ferguson. And the ostensible solution to the perceived crises of the 1910s and 20s, the imagined, patriarchal, heteronormative African-American family, has lived and lives a long and important life with enduring effects. None of the crises put forward, the USDA's crisis of non-mechanized and therefore non-modern farming, white plantation owners' crisis of labor mobility, Tuskegee leaders' crisis of poverty and poor health, none of these crises were solved by the purported solution of the patriarchal African-American family. But this new geography of containment that we see coalescing in places like 1920s Dallas County, Alabama, became a powerful ideological tool in the management of race and gendered bodies. It forms a crucial part of the United States' international development strategies of the post-war era. While returning to the United States most dramatically in Daniel Patrick Moynihan's 1965 treatise on the so-called dysfunctional black family, a treatise that explicitly used the discourse of development and the language of pathological matriarchy to explain economic oppression as one of imperiled masculinity. And its effects, accumulated through time and reinforced through other geographies of containment, are seen and felt every time a black body is perceived to be out of place. On my most recent trip to Alabama last summer, I realized that I could combine some research at the state archives with a personal pilgrimage, and so I returned to Montgomery, Alabama for the first time in 43 years. I forgot, or more likely didn't know, that my walking route from the hotel to the archives would take me around Court Square, site of one of the largest slave markets in the South, and later where Rosa Parks and others began the Montgomery bus boycott. I couldn't get my camera dry enough from the humidity, as you can see here, to get a good shot, but there were historical markers on the route, unlike when I had lived here, recognizing the significance of what was now the distant past. Heading up Dexter Avenue toward the archives, located just across the way from the Capitol, I was taken by complete surprise. How could I not have realized how close Martin Luther King's Dexter Avenue Church was to the state capitol? It sits just below it, barely a block away. As I stood there under that very hot sun, just several days after 9 people had died in a shooting in a similarly historically significant African-American church in Charleston, South Carolina, I felt even more strongly than I had ever felt for the truth of what James Baldwin had written during that same year, 1965, that protesters finally made their way to the Capitol from Selma along the very street I was standing on. History, James Baldwin wrote, does not refer merely or even principally to the past. We carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do. As I tried to show here, analyzing the historical geography of race, gender, and place in America is important for many reasons, but none are more pressing than understanding American racisms and what is really at stake in those suppositions that assume the criminality or worse of a black body of place. Thank you. Our wonderful first commentator, Ruth Wilson Gilmore.
Good afternoon. How's everybody? Do you need to stretch? Yeah. Stretch. Okay. I'm very happy to be sharing some reflections on what we just heard, and it's a little bit less reflections about Mona's content and more about contextualizing something that is already rich with context. So if you bear with me, I will talk for a few minutes, however many minutes I'm allotted, which I'm not sure.
It was never clear.
Yeah, okay. As you know, Mona's research is focused on the 19-teens and 20s, but of course there's a long reach that comes before that period and a dramatic reach that brings us to the present, as Mona showed us in her conclusion. But certainly the story that she tells is a story of capitalism. And it's a story of capitalism and the coevolution of large-scale, complex governmental institutions and the various fractions of capital, in this case, as in all cases, in some way racialized, whether or not there are black people present, who seek to guarantee their ability to extract value from labor and land. So the precursor, of course, to the United States Department of Agriculture, which was founded in 1862, initiated by Abraham Lincoln during that period, huge period of state expansion during the early years of the Civil War. The precursors of that department were found in the establishment of a patent office in the 1830s that was designed to patent especially various improvements in agriculture. Eventually patents migrated into, I think, commerce, but agriculture came into its own as a standalone department in 1862. Now, 1862, of course, is just about the year when the enormous general strike throughout the South on the part of people who were enslaved set off the self-liberation project of enslaved people during the Civil War. So as you know, Lincoln didn't free anybody, and even when he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, only the people who were still on paper enslaved in the states that were still rebelling were freed. It wasn't universal at all. But people were working very hard to free themselves. Now I bring up this matter of the origins of the United States Department of Agriculture because it does make me think about another through line that relates to Mona's larger project, and that is the project of understanding the workings of international development, the kind of thought that goes into developmentalist practice in the capitalist world. And that is that the patents and the patent office came together and consolidated just at about the time, of course, that credit and the possibility of getting credit from somebody who couldn't see you and couldn't touch you led up to the time when the U.S. embarked on the Mexican-American War, as well as expanded its conquest of various lands to the west. So the Mexican-American War was a project of land accumulation, but one in which, under the logic of manifest destiny that required the maintenance of a white Herrenvolk republic, those who pursued that law decided that war decided that the last thing they wanted to do was bring all those brown and red and black people from Greater Mexico into the Union. So the line that was drawn in the part of former Mexico that became part of the United States was drawn quite specifically to exclude as many people as possible while bringing in as much land as possible. Now, from 1865 on, of course, as Mona shows quite eloquently, the huge transition in the U.S. South in the former slave states was the transition on the part of white power, what Clyde Woods calls the urban plantocracy, from being labor lords to becoming landlords. And what that entailed, of course, again, as Mona said, was various mechanisms to tie people to land who were no longer tied to their owners. As we learned from Black Reconstruction in America, Du Bois's wonderful, 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 wonderful must-read book, published in 1935, the people of the South, including and especially the black people of the South, devised many, many ways to organize or reorganize themselves in order to try to make the places where they had been fighting for their own liberation places where they could flourish and have lives and homes. Whether or not they subscribed to patriarchal or other family forms made no difference. And Du Bois said quite famously in one of his footnotes that the experience of the Negro worker under Reconstruction provides the researcher with the opportunity to study inductively the Marxian theory of the state. Now I say that to you, one, because it's one of my favorite sentences ever written by anybody, but also because the state that was developing quite rapidly and in quite complex ways under the Lincoln and then subsequently the Grant administration at the federal level, the state at the more local level that was going through a series of crises and reconfigurations was also contradictorily faced with state formation from the ground up. So they weren't anarchists, they were actually building states. And a Reconstruction, as you know, led to a great deal of outmigration, so much so that in the 1870s there were hearings in the United States Congress trying to figure out how to stop the outmigration of black people. So again, this was a question that pertained to the period that Mona has talked to us about, and it was a question that also shaped a lot of understanding and concern in the 1870s and well into the 1880s. That's when my grandfather left Savannah, Georgia. Great-grandfather left Savannah, Georgia with my grandfather. But then, as we know from Harriet Tubman, the great leader on the Underground Railroad, the fact of the matter is that even under the most dire circumstances, even the most oppressed people actually make a place and make home. It's not as though the people who were enslaved or formerly enslaved during Reconstruction or put under the iron-fisted Jim Crow laws, black codes, and so on and so forth in the period starting with the Redemption didn't have place and didn't have home. Of course they did. That's what Sarah Haley writes about, that's what Jennifer Morgan writes about, that's what Stephanie Camp writes about, that's what so many scholars are writing and rewriting and rewriting and rewriting. And certainly the case was, as Harriet Tubman pointed out, when she was leading people on the Underground Railroad. As she put it, I crossed the land to freedom, the land of which I had always been dreaming. I got there and there was no one to take my hand and welcome me to the land of the free. Because after all, wasn't my home back down there in her case in Maryland, in the quarters, among the old people and my brothers and my sisters. So certainly part of the story of not so much the bodies, but the people in the South is a story not only of people who wish to and manage to exercise their mobility and leave, but also people who, in spite of the constraints, were trying to make home where they were, however they were trying to make it. And that is more or less the situation that the Tuskegee Institute, a particular form of racial uplift, but certainly by no means the only one, as Mona well knows, and the United States Department of Education, of Agriculture came together to put into place a rather typical, indeed, progressive improvement uplift program. Thinking about this and thinking about Mona's larger project, which is the project of understanding international development, brings me to the theme, another theme or another topic, which I'd like to discuss for a few minutes, and that is the origin and development of the journal that became the journal called Foreign Affairs. Foreign Affairs started in 1910 at Clark University, and I believe its founding editor was a professor of geography at the Clark University School of Geography. I could be wrong, but I think he was. And it was called the Journal of Race Development. The Journal of Race Development was published for 10 years, and it was all about trying to figure out how the various colonized people, including the black people of the United States of America, would eventually become self-determining actors in the economic and productive world. That's what that journal was for. So the Journal of Race Development precedes this intervention that Tuskegee and the United States Department of Agriculture were making there in Alabama as well as elsewhere. And I wonder how to what extent the thinking that went into that journal might have shaped the practices that we heard Mona talk about today. By the way, you can read the Journal of Race Development online. It's free at JSTOR because it's out of copyright protection. And I teach the first volume, the entire thing, every single year to my students. The editors included Du Bois, Boaz, Kroiber, all these names you know. They were editors of this journal. So I have a couple of other things to say, and then I'll sit down. As Mona pointed out, between 1919 and 1940, the rate of black farm ownership declined by 50%. However much the Department of Agriculture promoted in name ownership, home ownership or farm ownership, which are not necessarily an identity, we know that that decline produced a lot of outmigration of men from households and communities, whether or not they were patriarchal. They lost those guys because they had to go somewhere else to work. So that by 1940, as Judith Stacy has shown, the so-called absent black father, who Moynihan was whining about in 1965, had gone somewhere to be a bricklayer or a builder or a farmer or something else. The role that the United States Department of Agriculture might have played in that decline in farm ownership is certainly echoed today in the entire series of investigations that people are doing here in the United States and around the world about land dispossession, especially black people and indigenous people all over the world. All over the world. The Department of Agriculture tends to be most actively one of the defendants in cases brought on the part of black farmers in the United States concerning land loss. But if we look at the global scale, as we did in a symposium I hosted at the City University of New York Graduate Center recently, we see that not only are large-scale governmental organizations participating in land grabs and private for big profit banks and so on and so forth participating in land grabs, but also the pension fund that probably 3/4 of the people in this room are enrolled in, and that's TIAA-CREF, is also a land grabber, dispossessing black people and indigenous people around the world. The last point I'd like to make before I sit down is that I was quite surprised not to encounter Bobby Wilson's thinking in this piece. Now, Mona's writing about a part of Alabama different from Birmingham, but if there's one place where we can go to get a very strong sense of the Kondratiev cycles that give us some insight into the ways that the plantocracy, for example, and the other capitalist elites draw the federal and local state in, and then push them out, and then draw them in, and then reconfigure them and push them out again. We can get that in Bobby Wilson's book. His work, the work of Robin Kelly, which also raises the question of how Southern sharecroppers were organizing with and became themselves communists, gives also a contradictory view to this story of what the Tuskegee Institute and the USDA did together. And finally, if we want to turn to fiction to get a sense of that front porch and how attractive it might be, we can do no better than to turn to Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God. Granted, it's not Alabama, but it's all about, among other things, a struggle between two generations of black women. One woman who wants to go, Jeannie, who wants to leave and get moving and move and move and move, and then her auntie, who wants to do nothing more than sit on her front porch and rock. Thank you.
So I'm slightly mischief with the order. But,
Right. Our next speaker will be Caroline. Sorry.
So, and I've got a couple of slides. So, thank Mona for inviting me to speak in the panel, and also the openness that she gave us to respond to her piece. She basically said, thank you, we can take it in any direction that we want. So there's lots of rich themes that I could have chosen to draw on from Mona's paper, but I work mostly on the black presence in late 19th century, early 20th century Britain, particularly London. And so I wanted to share some thoughts around some of the themes that come through around belonging, containment, intersections and mobilities, perhaps also staying in place, around someone that I've been researching for some years now, Paul Downing. The majority of his archive is held among the patient records of the City of London Asylum, and that's the bound book of records on the left there. So the City of London Asylum was the only asylum run and owned by the Corporation of London. Its construction began in 1862, following a rather reluctant acknowledgement from the city that it needed to provide accommodation and treatments for its pauper lunatics. It opened in 1866 with a capacity for 250 patients. By 1872, it was full. In 1900, the senior assistant medical officer assessed that their patients came via the city from all parts of England and from all quarters of the globe. Paul Downing entered the asylum after passing through the East End's Bow Infirmary in September 1905. Downing, a labourer, had been apprehended in central London by Police Constable Bailey, who recorded that he first encountered Downing stopping omnibuses on Blackfriars Bridge. At the time, he was apparently making strange comments about his wife, but overall his behaviour was noted to be quiet, and his body being, to quote, in a fair condition. Yet at the police station, Downing was examined and found to be a person of unsound mind, and it was recommended that he be remanded forthwith to the City of London Infirmary at Bow for further investigations, which would result in a hearing before a magistrate at the Mansion House. Paul Downing remained on the ward of the Bow Infirmary for 3 days, but then it was discovered that he was, in fact, a woman named Caroline Brogden. Caroline Brogden thus appeared at the Mansion House on the 13th of September 1905, by which point she'd been remanded for 6 days. The evidence for notes for the hearings in the Mansion House do not survive before the 1920s, but Caroline's hearing caught the attention of the press, and the case was written up in both local and national newspapers. According to one report, Paul Downing had been living in Britain for at least 2 years, having fled to France and afterwards for England for fear of being lynched in America. Before arriving in London, he had worked most recently on a farm in Kent, though Paul had been dismissed from his position due to his intimate relationship with a female servant. He had moved on and found his last job working as an odd jobs man for a Bermondsey undertaker in South East London, which is not far from where I live now. For the press, the story ended with Downing Brogden's admission into the asylum, where a massive detail about her body was recorded. The condition of her body, of her tongue, of her expression, whether she had bruises, if she was epileptic, no, if she was suicidal, no, if she was dangerous, no. There is no comment made next to the space for observation of the skin, but later it has been noted in the top corner of her record that Caroline was, quote, a woman of colour, American Indian Cherokee native. And even though Caroline had refused to give details of her identity during her hearing and to the authorities at all, her original home in the United States was given as North Georgia. For Paul Downing, nuance and slippage within the asylum became impossible. Caroline was fixed as female, and as such her continuing claims to have a wife were evidence as part of her diagnosis for her delusional insanity. By April the following year, Caroline was described as very insane, and again this diagnosis was wrapped up with her confused relationships with two nurses on the ward who she believed to be her lover and her wife. In June 1906, Caroline died in the asylum, still very insane, but most recently had been suffering from acute pneumonia. The geographies of containment experienced by Paul Downing did not operate in the same ways as those imposed through the USDA's efforts. But the racing and gendering of Downing Brogden's body speaks to similar themes as those raised by Mona's paper. There is the difficulty of shaping a personal political identity under the hostility of white supremacy and the heteronormity of the 20th century, the continuingly difficult relationship between blackness and mental health diagnosis, as well as the familiar echoes of chance encounters with the police having devastating consequences for black bodies. And there are circulations of race thinking which underpin transatlantic stories of racial violence such as lynching, as well as the mobility of secrets and the powerlessness of those kept in place through castle regimes to maintain a sense of self. By the time Caroline Brogden's hearing at the Mansion House, she had lost control of her life as Paul Downing, with reports of the court hearing circulating in newspapers across Britain and as far as Australia, where the West Gippsland Gazette in Victoria ran the story under the headline, "In Man's Clothes, an American Negress, Her Queer Delusions." In Britain, history is embedded in national popular culture, from Sunday evening period dramas, some of which we understand are quite popular here across the pond, to public heritage sites, museums, galleries and archives. But under the current government's policy of austerity, the role these spaces play in the remaking of history is becoming narrower at a time when we need more scholars and students to work on these spaces and on these themes in different cities, towns and villages, from different time periods, from different political and class perspectives. We're trying to persuade students to join us when funding is hard to come by, and as highlighted in Mona's 2005 AAG column, the geography curriculum is so white, is not an easy task. And the responses to the South African and Oxford-based Rose Must Fall campaigns have illustrated how ingrained the refusal to acknowledge the role of racism in the making of modern Britain remains. Black histories are even more marginalised in Britain than they are here. Not that it's a competition. And their marginalisation in part reflects a different history of the black presence in Britain, the size of the communities and their limited social and political mobility within the nation. But the importance of race thinking in the making of Britain means that the suppositions which assume the criminality or worse of a black body out of place are as powerfully imposed and as difficult to challenge. And as Mona says, historical geographies are an important, indeed essential part of that response.
Derek Alderman, and please stay because then I have the great honor of awarding the Presidential Achievement Award after Derek's comments.
If it'll keep people in the room, we can give the award now. I certainly don't want to take away from Audrey's honor in any way. I wish to thank Mona and the Association for the great honor to be part of this important plenary event. And allow me to express some personal appreciation to Mona for the leadership she's shown in our discipline, and in particular the role model that she's become for many of us in historical geography. So if you don't mind, please join me in thanking Mona. Mona's scholarship is frequently characterized by an analytical nuance and a frankness about social power and a sensitivity to difference and identity. And this presentation that you've heard tonight is no different. I guess I'm still on the East Coast. It feels like night. It's not afternoon.
It is night.
Yeah. And it was in fact a pleasure to read and hear this presentation a couple of times. I do feel it's important and timely that Mona has delivered a pretty important paper on the African American experience in a year in which black lives and geographies have been very much on the minds and hearts of many of us, as well as prominently displayed in headlines and on CNN newscasts and so forth. The African American bodily struggle for survivability, freedom of movement, and self-determination has a long historical and spatial arc. Identifying and giving legitimacy to this long arc of black historical geography is not simply the right thing to do analytically or theoretically. Rather, there is much at stake politically, ensuring that more of us do the kind of scholarship that Mona is offering us tonight. As the noted historian Manning Marable argued, the act of reconstructing history is tightly linked to the political practices or praxis of transforming the present and the future. And in effect, Marable is suggesting that a more critical study and remembering of the past might very well provide us guidance in challenging contemporary racism. And in fact, I will say that one of the things that I think Mona has done for me as a historical geographer is shown me that I don't have to freeze myself in the past, but in fact always think about those entanglements between the past and the present, and by extension the future. I'm friendly to the idea, I'm a scholar of memory for those that don't know who I am. I'm very friendly to the idea that the remaking of memory and history can have political efficacy. But it requires an explicit connection of social and racial justice concerns with doing historical geography. I'm prompted to consider the social and intellectual value that we might gain by creating a larger institutional profile for black geographies within historical geography, within the larger field of geography, even if you're not a historical geographer. If you're not, you should be. And more importantly, since we're here at this meeting, within the wider institutional context of AAG. All right. I get a little love out there. It's all right. It's a tough job.
Someone's got to do it.
Yeah. It's no secret, and I've written about this a few times with my good colleague Josh Inwood in the back, that I would like to see a greater incorporation of civil rights into geography education. And no doubt that black geography's agenda should be a major pillar in this effort. And I would really encourage those, and there are several of you in the audience that I work with and talk with who are in the midst of organizing a black geography's agenda, that let's captivate, let's take advantage of, let's catalyze, and push us forward. And I'm here to help in whatever way I can. I don't want to turn this into a political speech. I apologize.
I said you could say whatever you wanted.
Yeah, you did say that, and that was quite dangerous of you. For me, I think Mona's discussion, to come back to her paper and get off my soapbox, really points to me to two really important themes that can help us advance future work. The first of those deals with mobilities, and the second one deals with the South. And as someone who grew up in the South, I couldn't help but sort of gravitate to that point. The first theme, though, I want to talk about is this idea of developing a mobility term in black geographies. And Mona exposes the great links in her paper to which powerful stakeholders, black and white, sought to control and contain the very movements of African Americans within the early 20th century Southern economy, often under the name and the guise of agricultural and home improvement and family engineering. Using Mona's discussion and other recent work by geographers as a launching pad, we might consider the value of geographers examining the larger role of geographic mobility within African American life and the struggle for civil rights. As Ewan Haig has noted, the right of mobility in the U.S. has been linked to citizenship, and fundamentally intertwined with the construction of racial identities. And as I mentioned, Josh Inwood in the back there, Josh and I have written recently about the racial biopolitics of mobility, the ways in which mobility and immobility become intertwined with the political negotiation of life, and the historical and contemporary survivability of African Americans and other people of color. Engaging this mobility theme would certainly require, as Mona has done, examining movement as a means of racial control and exclusion. But this approach also would need to explore mobility as a form of African American resistance and human creativity, a means of recovering what Catherine McKittrick has famously called a black sense of place. And this struggle for the right to mobility is one that has shaped the black geographic experience from enslavement to current hyper-policing of America's streets and ongoing transportation campaigns. While not ignoring some recent additions and excellent contributions to the annals and the special mobilities issue, we as geographers, and I would say more specifically historical geographers, have not really done an adequate job of writing the full historical geography of black movement, mobility, and travel. And I think Mona's paper certainly forecasts the need for this, and as I said before, provides a nice launching pad. The second theme that I would like to pull out of Mona's paper and have it perhaps think more broadly and contextually is what I call, and you'll just have to put up with me on this, the Southern turn in black geographies, which almost seems wrong. But Mona discusses, in fact, in such a beautiful way, it's actually one of my favorite parts of the paper, the meaning of her own personal story of returning home to the South to conduct her research. And I would suggest that maybe the discipline of geography might benefit from a similar turn or return to the southeastern United States. Not to the neglect of other regions and places, but you know, we're starting to see quite a bit of scholarship that's starting to embark on the scholarly journey back south. And we have some folks here. LaToya Eves is in the audience. Priscilla McCutcheon, I don't know if she's here. She never gives me the time of day anyway. And Rich Shine, who's over here on the side, who acts like I'm not talking about him. There's many others, but the point is, you know, I think we're starting to generate a very interesting critical literature that could be a basis for thinking about black geographies in the Southern context, and what does that do to advance that discussion? Again, not at the neglect of other regions of focus and foci. A Southern turn in the examination of the historical geography of African Americans is not a repeat or a retreat to traditional Southern studies, which really went, as we say in the South, hog wild, mapping and justifying and promoting the fact that the South was distinctive, unique, exceptional, and pretty damn white. But in fact, this Southern turn's about paying really close attention, as Mona has done, to the importance of black bodies, lives, and movements in a region that really is very foundational to our national understandings and debates about race and racism. Beginning with the plantation economy that undergirded almost every aspect of early American capitalism, the South, which was a major battlefield for civil rights, is also now, tragically, a significant site for the ongoing erosion of these very rights and the unreconstructed path of white supremacy. So the South is increasingly sought out, in fact, by African Americans as they attempt to reclaim the region through residential relocation, tourism, and family ancestral reconnections. The South right now is a very extremely interesting region, and I think Mona's paper really directs our attention to the potential of very good critical Southern analysis as part of a larger national, global analysis of race and development. So thank you for your time.
At this point, I would like to ask Mona to step forward to present the outstanding presidential award.
Thank you. Thank you all to fabulous commentators for doing what I hoped, which was to take comments and push them out. I think that's what I said. Push them out from what I had said. It is my great honor to present the AAG Presidential Achievement Award to Audrey Kobayashi. Audrey is recognized for her foundational contributions to understanding the intersectionality of gender, race, class, and all forms of socioeconomic difference that have reshaped what geography is and can be. For her insistence that geography and geographers reflect critically on their whiteness, and for her profound commitment to strengthening geography by encouraging new and challenging ways of seeing and understanding our world through her tireless work as editor, mentor, teacher, colleague, and friend. This award was established by the AAG to recognize individuals who have made long-standing and distinguished contributions to the discipline of geography. It was easy for me to decide who I wanted to honor. Audrey's long list of scholarly accomplishments that fill over 50 pages of her CV are important, of course, but I wanted more importantly to honor Audrey's fierce commitment to fighting for social justice within geography, the academy, and more broadly, for her perseverance and willingness to raise her hand and have a voice at the table or in the room when others are afraid to do so, and for her great warmth, humor, and grace, all qualities that I admire and aim to emulate. Thank you, Audrey.
I just want to say first, thank you, Mona, for all the work that you do, for your brilliant presentation tonight, and thank you to all of the commentators. It is just tremendously uplifting to hear this depth of scholarship and political commitment, and nothing is more important than to match our political commitment with the quality of our scholarship, and it's absolutely wonderful. It makes me very proud to be a geographer.